would like to get back to you about all these points in writing in details, but I want to build on one point that was made about the question of who's in charge. Definitely agree it's al-Bashir who's in charge, and I think where this is coming from, what is calling the shot at the end of the day, I believe it's not ideology or foreign power. I think it's money at the end of the day, and I think the only way to get that kind of change in human rights and religious freedom, as Lyman said, if there are elements in there that will always push aside human rights as something that is part of something on the table. And I think the way to go about it is to make human rights profitable, to make it the thing on the table, the main thing, and religious freedom and human rights the thing to negotiate about, not something additional on the table that they can cast aside. And yeah, with that, that's all I wanted to say about that.
Thank you. We're almost finished because we do have to be out of here by 5, but I just wanted to ask maybe a lightning round here. Do we need a Sudan special envoy again? I'm thinking of introducing a bill. It shouldn't take a bill. The president could do it with a snap of his fingers. But is that needed? Is it a recommendation you would make? Secondly, you know, Juba and South Sudan, and Greg and I were in Juba last August, meeting with Salva Kiir, pressing these issues of humanitarian access to end to sexual violence, and now, sadly, a famine. That has kind of taken the eyes off of Khartoum and put them squarely to the south. Has Khartoum then exploited that lack of scrutiny that they are not getting to the degree they used to? The church leaders, and that would include Muslim, Christian, you know, the imams, all the church leaders, are they being used effectively in any kind of interfaith effort to try to, or is that a non-starter? And finally, UNAMID, you know, we met with UNMISS when we were in South Sudan. The Security Council has made some very significant changes to their operating procedures, especially after the debacle in the terrain compound, and when they did not act. And you know, I did have the privilege of speaking to the Security Council. I was invited, as I said earlier, by Nikki Haley to be at Blair House, to be one of 4 members presenting. And I pointed out, and you know, they were obviously the ones that are in charge of this, ultimately. You know, they've made some very significant systemic reforms. Hopefully they pan out well going forward. But Anamid, your thoughts on that? Is their mandate sufficient? Are they doing what they should do? And then anything you would want to add, please do, and then we'll conclude.
I can start quickly on that. Thank you. You know, I think the administration is reviewing how many special envoys they ought to have for what purposes. I think in this case, there should be a special envoy, empowered, as Mr. Titoni had said, because the kind of negotiations that need to be done on both Sudan and South Sudan require high-level attention. Has to be someone who speaks for the president. People know he speaks or she speaks for the president, and can engage on hard negotiations in both North and South. You know, there wasn't as much attention to Sudan lately and thank you for this hearing, because South Sudan is such an overwhelming problem. But I think it's coming back as we look at this EO and the issues that are being raised and the kinds of the decisions. But I do think it's important when you talk about Sudan, it goes to a question Mr. Garrett raised, they are players in the South Sudan situation. They've pulled back on some of their support for the opposition. That was part of the understanding in this track. But there's much more to be done on South Sudan. IGAD is divided. They are major players in IGAD. I would like to see them step up much more constructively. On UNMISS, I think they have improved in management, but they are limited. Right now, they are overwhelmed with their protection of the people who are right in those POCs. They're called protection of civilian areas. They don't really intercede between the government and the opposition. The fighting's going on. They don't have quite the capacity, let alone the mandate. So they are not, they're relevant and can be more relevant for protection. They're not relevant, quite frankly, to stopping the fighting.
All for your expertise. If nobody else wants to comment, let me just say, did you?
Maybe just 2 seconds on the envoy question. I apologize. I mean, I think we generally would agree with that. I think the bigger issue is what Mr. Tony said is, in order to have an envoy who's going to really make an impact, you need a policy. And until there are policymakers clearly in place, an envoy runs the risk of not being able to advance clear policy and not being taken seriously, as Mr. Tony said. So, I think our perspective is, if there is a clear policy and a strong policy, and then someone who can clearly and strongly carry it out with a clear backing of the administration that is clear to Khartoum has the backing of the administration, as again Mr. Tony made clear, then that's important. And I think the last point I wanted to make by jumping in is just, this is where there is clearly a role for Congress and clearly a role for this committee to make clear what are the priorities and what needs to be done now in this, while there is this uncertainty. This is really when Congress needs to act and take the mantle by establishing what are the policies that really matter and what are the mechanisms and measures we need in order to achieve them. So I think that's ultimately where
Does that
where
mean
we can
new
end.
legislation or just?
It could, yeah. I mean, it should.
Any
It
thoughts
should.
you have
It
on
should.
that,
It should
please?
mean legislation. We've, there's a proposal that I think would have a lot of these measures in them and outline the diplomatic track that's needed to get at the human rights and peace track that we talked about. So yes, it's legislation. It's also, clearly indicating to the administration these are what the priorities are. But
You did say in your testimony it should be delinked from the 5 tracks. Why
Yes.
wouldn't it be incorporated?
Well, I think from our perspective, the 5 tracks have they have their own trajectory. They have their own limited set of issues they're dealing with. What we're talking about are much bigger issues that need much different pressures. And so in some ways, let's not muddy the waters on either side. Let's kind of keep 2 sets going. So.
Sudan and South Sudan, the whole issue has traditionally had very good bipartisan support. It in a town right now that's, better than we, it's hard to work with the other parties, whichever party you're in right now. And this is a winner as far as bipartisan approach. And I know that you're willing to work on issues with everybody, but the president and others, this could be a winner and a good way to develop some relationships, because at the end of the day, working with the other side of the aisle is always about relationships, not always about party politics. I want to underscore what I wrote in the testimony, what Ambassador Lyman said, though. I think I'm not trying to, if a tree falls in North Carolina, I'm not blaming Khartoum all the time. But this was their policy for years and years and years to destabilize South Sudan. The rebel movements, they were very good at it in the North-South, call it that war. They have a network, they have the capability to run everybody, and they can run circles in some ways around and destabilizing South Sudan. So if you're able to get that classified review, I would really ask to know the history of that, to the extent that you have the time to listen, and to know what's halted in their opinion and what's continued. And this needs to be on the table, because the 2 countries, they were one country for a long time. They're linked. Their futures are linked. If they're not getting along, then there's going to be destabilizing and massive humanitarian issues. So that's one thing I would not let go of.
It's an excellent point. Yesterday, Greg and I did get a classified briefing. We want to include others and make it, and now that we have even more questions to ask, we'll do another one. But it's a great idea, because we always want to not do something unwittingly to damage what is being done, it's been well thought out. So I can't talk about the briefing, obviously, but we did have one yesterday. But your point is very well taken about getting Royce, Engel, Karen Bass, and I, and others all to do it. Thank you for that. I deeply appreciate it. We appreciate it, the subcommittee. Your information, we will get it over to the state, but more importantly, to some of the people at the White House, hopefully, because obviously we benefit from your expertise and wisdom, Congress and the executive branch. So thank you so very, very much. The hearing's adjourned.